You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and this may, surprisingly enough, be our most negative episode ever. Why? Because we simply cannot find a single defender of Leos Carax's artistically ambitious 2021 musical, Annette. We know they exist. We've seen them around, including on the ICM forum. But from the co-host of Talking Images, or at least those of us who have seen it so far, each and every one of us have been left quite, well, as you can read from the episode title, disappointed. Why is that? Do we just hate musicals? Are we not big Sparks fans? Did Carax just make a bigger dud than Pola X? And apologies to any Pola X defenders, I know they're out there. Did we misunderstand it completely? Oh, and just how disappointed are we? I guess we'll find out. And if our takes annoy you, remember, you can go to icmforum.com and let us know just how wrong we are. Anyhow, don't worry. It won't be all doom and gloom, since there are no overly positive or supportive voices in this episode. We'll try our very best to be at least nice and highlight what we thought worked. Because a film with this much talent and so much creativity definitely deserves it, even if at the end of the day it left us disappointed. So let's just start by airing our disappointments as I introduce my very first co-host Mathieu and pose the fairly obvious question: how did Annette disappoint you?
Well, did Annette disappoint me? I guess I don't know if I would say that, because I didn't have that huge expectations, I suppose. I was curious about it. And I think you make it sound like we are going to be a little tougher. At least I enjoyed Annette. I didn't love it, but I did enjoy it for the most part. I haven't seen any Leos Carax films, so I can't really speak to that in that area. But I was very curious to see Annette, and in one way it delivered, because it is a very strange film. It is a very unique film that does its own thing. I guess the issue I have with it is that I did not really love the music. I think the music worked in some spaces, especially the opening and the ending, for what the movie was doing, but I guess I did not really enjoy it that much, which, for a musical, is always going to be a bit of a problem. So that's
a big problem.
Yeah, so that's what I would say my reaction to Annette is. It's a film that I find interesting, that is very bold, very ambitious, but yeah, I didn't quite embrace it because the music didn't completely convince me.
I can see why you weren't that disappointed when you hadn't seen any Leos Carax films before, because at least to me, he's one of the most talented directors working today, and I had such high hopes for Annette. But to go on to Saul here, because I saw his reaction to you not having seen any Leos Carax movies in the chat. So Saul, assuming you're a bit of a Carax fan, how disappointed were you with Annette?
So just to clarify, I'm actually not a Leos Carax fan. He has made one really amazing film called Lovers on the Bridge, which he did in the early 90s. That's an absolutely amazing film. I've seen 3 others now, including Annette, so I've seen 4 of his films in total. And based on what else I'd seen from him, and based on all of the acclaim that Holy Motors got, I wasn't actually expecting a lot from Annette, because Holy Motors, for me, is one of those films that's got a really interesting premise and a really interesting lead performance, but a lot of it's completely random, and it ends with the biggest FU that I've ever seen a director give to his audience ever. So I have quite a bit of disdain for Holy Motors. So given all the acclaim that Holy Motors has received or whatever, I was approached Annette with some caution anyway. I did sort of get my hopes up a little bit when it won Best Director at Cannes. And then the film came second on the Cahiers du Cinema list for the year. And I thought, well, that's quite promising. We'll see what it's like. And it's got Adam Driver in, who I quite like as an actor. But I'd say there was a lot of things which I didn't like about the film. I'd say the most disappointing thing for me was the whole film was built on artifice, which is quite interesting, and things being artificial. But the biggest artifice of the entire film is that the daughter in the film is not a daughter, but there's an animatronic doll instead. in lieu of an actress as the toddler, which is the film's biggest weakness, because basically they're casting an unexpressive slab of plastic as the daughter, which for me just totally ruined any emotional punch that the film could have possibly had. So quite a few things that didn't rub me the right way, but definitely having the daughter as a slab of plastic was the thing which disappointed me the most about it.
Very interesting. Yeah, so I'm the only Leos Carax fan in this episode. So I definitely recommend his previous films to Mathieu. And just to show how different we are, Holy Motors is actually among my favorite films of the last decade. I'd probably place it in my top 5 of the last decade. So big disagreements there, but yet we both found Annette not to be great, which is quite interesting. So on my part, I think I share what Mathieu said. I just didn't connect with the music. And I actually like Sparks. I mean, I think some of their albums, especially from the 70s, are really great. So yeah, I just, most of these songs, like I think it started with a real proper banger. I mean, so Maybe Start it's great. It feels just like the old Spark stuff, and they're actually singing it as well. So that it started off on a fairly good note, at least musically. I think it ended on a good note musically, but the majority of the songs in between, some of them are good. A lot of them are just not really catchy. They were not really spellbinding. They were plot focus in a way, I guess, which is good, but they didn't grab me and it lacked that part. I mean, I love Artifice. That's why I had such big hopes for this film. But when the music started failing a little bit for me, that was the main crux of why this film did not work. But there are a lot of other smaller issues with it.
So with the music, I'm not somebody who really tends to notice music too much with films. So the songs for me, I guess, were generally okay, but there was one where I couldn't stop laughing, and it's not meant to be funny. But the police give the Adam Driver character in the third degree, and they sing it to him. And that's like the most absolutely ridiculous thing I think I've seen in any film from 2021. The police singing to him and trying to grill him while they're singing to him. And, that part, just sort of lost me. I'm like, this just completely doesn't work for me.
Well, how do you guys feel about Jacques Demy, right? About Les Parapluies de Cherbourg and Les Demoiselles de Rochefort? Because that felt a lot, it felt like they were kind of going for that, what with everything being sung, including, like you mentioned, the Miranda rights. And yes, I personally have a lot of troubles with Jacques Demy's musicals, so is in line with that. But Chris, I assume you're a fan, right?
No, actually. I like Jacques Demy. I don't hate his musicals. But no, I've actually never been a big fan of his musicals. And it is part of that style where every line is sung that didn't quite work for me with his films as well. That might actually be an overlap here, because I have heard that it is inspired by Demy to an extent. So yeah, that could definitely be an issue. And I guess you can say that any Demy fans should not give up on watching Annette just because we're deriding it.
So just to chime in, I haven't seen Umbrellas in a long time. I guess I would have seen it about 15 years ago. And I guess beyond the basic conceit of everything being sung, I don't remember that much about it. I liked it enough at the time. I didn't absolutely love it. I'll probably actually put in Model Shop as my favorite Jacques Demy film, which is obviously a bit different to the films that he's best known for.
That's why I wouldn't necessarily say it's a disappointment for me, because again, I thought it was a very interesting film, and especially visually. I think, Saul mentioned it winning Best Director in Cannes, and I think that's a deserved prize. It would not have been my choice out of the films that were at Cannes that I've seen, but it's a choice I get, because I think what Carax does visually is quite interesting in the way that the film is kind of a meeting between like the rock opera, right? Like the Who, the Tommy, or The Wall by Pink Floyd, and kind of classical opera in a sense, what you have literally Marion Cotillard playing an opera singer. And I think those scenes where he really uses this kind of aesthetic of the opera, I think of the scene on the boat, where you have this background that look kind of like very fake, what you mentioned, the artificiality, but I think it works quite well for a scene like that. And unlike Saul, I actually think the puppets, the conceit to have Annette being a puppet actually works for the film, especially because of where it goes. But I guess we'll discuss that later.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I completely agree. And just to be clear, I did not hate Annette. A lot of the visuals here are spectacular. Some of the shots of the boat, for instance, are incredible. And I think it really went for it in so many ways, including the choice of having the child played by a puppet. For me, it worked as well. I love that kind of artifice, and it also had a really strong payoff, which we won't get into right now. But still, it wasn't just the music that was a slight problem for me. And while a lot of the visuals were spectacular, I did actually have some issues with the visuals at points as well. I think the moment I actually started to be a little bit worried I wouldn't love Annette, the film, not the puppet, was actually almost at the very, very beginning, where you have this meta element. You have Sparks in the studio, you have Leos Carax having a cameo as a music producer. It's before this great opening song, so maybe start actually kicks off. It's that part of the conceit is really interesting, but that part of the film is also shot almost like it was a backstage music video, or like behind the scenes of a music video. You had this really rapid digital cuts, which didn't really work for me. And even when, Sparks starts getting up off their chairs, standing up, singing the song, they walk out, the actors come in, that didn't fill me with awe the way that type of opening scene should have felt. Even though the song itself was great, I think at that moment I still thought, oh, this could be a good or really great film. I was starting to be a little bit concerned, because this, like, your grand opener, and the way it was shot almost felt like the opener to a really good TV show, for instance. Like if the TV show was doing a musical number like this, it didn't feel the awe of, the master that at least to me, Leos Carax is. It didn't strike me as visually as he usually does either. So at that point, I started to get worried that, okay, this might not be, even though the song is great, even though a lot of things are still going really well, there might be some issues going on here.
I was worried there for a second, Chris, because we love Annette. I mean, the baby, right? It's sung multiple times in the film, so it must be true. I disagree with you on the opening. I think the opening is maybe better in my imagination than it is in reality, I guess. But I think it's good. I think comparing it to the opening of a TV show, I mean, there are great TV shows, I guess, in that sense. I think I really don't see what you're saying with the way it's filmed. I think it works really well, the long take, and again, the artificiality, what the theater troupe kind of presenting what they're going to do.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just to be clear, I'm not saying I think that scene is actually good. I'm just saying it didn't have the grandeur I would have expected from Carax. It looked like something on a smaller budget, or a little bit simpler than I would have expected him to do, especially after the elaborateness of Holy Motors. But obviously he gets there later in the film. He does all the crazy visual stuff. But I was a little bit, not let down, but I was a little bit concerned that it wasn't going in all out visually right there. And those early fast digital cuts also didn't necessarily work that well for me. I know you didn't have that big expectations, Mathieu, but at what moment did you start to realize that this wouldn't be a great film for you?
I guess I had trouble just getting into the film. Aside from that opening, the opening grabbed me, but then the film kind of lost me in the 30 minutes that followed. I suppose the song, right, the We Love Each Other So Much song, I get what it's doing, and I get, looking back at it, I think it's supposed to feel wrong, right? It's supposed to feel like very performative, they're trying to convince themselves as much as they're singing to the public. But yeah, I think it sounds like that. That's what I mean when I said I don't love the music. The repetitiveness, I get what it's doing on a conceptual level, but it's not very enjoyable. And I guess that's the sequence where the film lost me the most. Also, Adam Driver as a stand-up. I guess I'm thinking, well, who would go see that show? He seems awful. I don't know. He doesn't seem very funny. I mean, it's a dumb nitpick. It's a very artificial film. I'm not saying we need to buy in the reality of it entirely, but yeah, I guess I had trouble connecting with the film because of some of those elements.
Yeah, I think I felt somewhat similar too. I actually didn't think he was, well, I don't think he's that convincing as a stand-up, but I was really impressed by how much he just really went for it in those scenes and what he was doing there. I thought it was, like, again, the energy was a little bit off. I didn't quite buy him as a stand-up comedian either, but I really appreciated how he just went all for it.
Yeah, Adam Driver's comedy, stand-up comic scenes were definitely one of the biggest issues of the film for me, because the way the film was structured is sort of like a variation on A Star Is Born. We have the up-and-coming artist who then is downfall, but the thing is that we never actually see Adam Driver as a good stand-up comedian. All we see him as is as a desperate, failing, unfunny comic. He is reduced to performing half nude in desperation. I think if we saw some of his success beforehand, or if we saw him as actually a good stand-up comedian, I think it would have made his talent, his character progression a bit more interesting. But we only ever see him as a failing, sort of has been reduced to performing half nude. We don't actually see him as somebody successful. So the character arc for me never worked as much as I think it had the potential to, with a slight rewrite.
I actually disagree there. So, I mean, I agree that the comedy performance is kind of failing, but I think that first scene is meant to be his success story, because they have that scene when they meet up afterwards, and he says, "I killed them." And I think that was actually meant to be his really successful performance, setting him up as this provocateur performer, because that's kind of his whole image. And yeah, I just don't think that went that well either. I don't think it was convincing enough. But yeah, no, I actually do think they wanted that to be his big show, his success.
Yeah, he's definitely meant to be successful, right? The audience is responding exactly the way he wants, right? So, yeah.
Oh, wow. Like, if that's meant to be him, like, successful or whatever, I can't imagine what it would be like when he hits rock bottom, because, yeah, it's definitely not
Well,
my
we see
type
it
of
later.
humor.
Yeah, we see that later, but yes.
We do see him hit rock bottom, but not so much in terms of giving, like, a bad comedy show. I mean, like, if that's meant to be a good comedy show, I can't imagine what a bad one looks like.
Yeah, I think this is the most scathing criticism so far. The show Adam Driver as a comic, and his opening scene was so poor that Saul didn't even realize that it was meant to be good within the film's universe. So that's I think that might make Leos Carax cry at night. But Saul, to ask you the same question I asked Mathieu, at what point in the film did you realize that this would not be a great film for you?
Oh, I don't know. I'm tempted to say that part with Adam Driver performing half nude, but that was probably the first hint for me that, maybe this isn't going to quite be what I'm going to like. When we have this slab of plastic that's posted out as being the daughter, I think for that was kind of, one of the points where I'm like, this isn't going to be an interesting film for me if we can't actually relate to it at an emotional level, because Leos Carax is so obsessed with artifice, he's not even going to put somebody in who's capable of delivering human emotions. So, I mean, that was bad for it. But look, even like the thing like the Miranda rights or whatever in song, like there was all these parts in it where my heart kept skipping a beat, and I'm going like, yeah, no, 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 no. Like I spent most of the film going, maybe this will be a 6 out of 10. It's got interesting things in it, but by the end of it, I'm like, no, it really hasn't really done anything for me. So I don't know. I'd probably say the Adam Driver part was probably the performing half nude that first got me worried. But there was just so many things along the way where I'm going, yeah, no, I don't think this is going to be a film which I'm going to end up liking.
We've covered some of it already, and for you, that puppet seems to be the clear spoiler element here. But what other things was it that for you stopped Annette from being a great work? And don't worry, we'll get into the positives and try to look at what actually makes it work to one extent or another later.
I'm not sure what else I could say specifically that made it not work for me, but I guess maybe just the whole artifice thing didn't quite strike me the way that I'd like it to. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Holy Motors, but my next favourite Carax film after Lovers on the Bridge would be Movu Sung, which he did in the 1980s. And that's just got some really amazing, very simple special effects. Like you've got the lead guy throwing a pen up, and it goes up off screen and it drops down as an alpha. He throws something else up, it goes up off screen and it drops down as something else. So we've got some of these very simple special effects there, which all they've had to do was basically have somebody above the camera catch an object and drop another object down. And with such simple effects, that artifice is just so magical in Movu Sung. And then we've got this artifice, which is just so extremely over the top, with all the singing, with the theatrics, with the breaking the fourth wall, with the animatronic doll. It's just so over the top there in Annette that the magic isn't really quite there the same way. I mean, I don't know how else I can really explain it, but it's just so natural the way it happens in Mauvais Sung, and the way that it happens in Annette just seems so forced, I guess, for lack of a better word.
No, I get that. I actually completely disagree, but I'll bring that up in the section we talk about what we think works for Annette. Going back to the music a little bit, I actually re-listened to the soundtrack before this episode, and I listened to the short version, the 40-minute conversion, and it's pretty okay. It has a great opener, a great closer, some relatively good stuff in between. But some of it just doesn't work. Like I think that the pivotal scene, and we get that with spoiler territory on the boat, where they're singing, where essentially it's just again repetition, and it's essentially this Adam Driver going, "I'm not that drunk. I'm not that drunk," and that's kind of the reference is like really basic, and it's not catchy. I think that's a big issue, but it's worth noting that the full soundtrack is 2 hours long. So when they tried to make this essentially sellable and as good as possible, they trimmed it down to around 43 minutes, and it more or less works. But the full soundtrack of the full scene, like that Miranda rights section with the police, for instance, are not on this short version. So they essentially cut out most of the song numbers from it. And I think that says a little bit about just how not everything necessarily works. And I just think that, yes, there were so many numbers here that just aren't. And that's a relative problem I actually do have with the Meek, going back to that point earlier, where much of the singing doesn't stand out as a musical. Maybe that is an issue I have, that I want the songs in a musical to actually be catchy rather than just being a natural part of the narrative. But that was an issue for me here. And a second issue I actually had, and we might disagree a little bit on it, but I think that the way they used Simon Helberg's character, who is kind of like the third lead of sorts in the first part of the film, was a little frustrating, because he has this connection to Anne, played by Marion Cotillard, but he's never really seen with her. He's in the opening scene and is essentially not there, and I think at one or two times you kind of just check in with him for a couple of minutes, just like, this guy also exists in our universe. And he might be relevant later, and that felt a little off to me. So that there were all of these other little things that didn't quite work, but I would say the music not standing out was the biggest issue for me with Annette.
So, Chris, you didn't like the scene where Simon Helberg is directing? Or directing, is that the word? You know what I mean.
I think his song there is pretty good, but the function is just, I'm here, this is what I'm doing, I exist. And narratively, I would have liked to see him involved in some way previously with these characters, because it just feels so disjointed at that point. The scene is so perfectly okay, but just his character, the way it's used, is just feels... I mean, I guess they acknowledge it with that scene that he is disjointed and he just exists on the sidelines, but it just didn't quite work for me.
That's funny, because I really like that scene. I think that it's one of 3-4 scenes that I think are pretty great in the film. And I think musically, it's actually one of the best moments in the film, right, with the choirs. And
I'll agree with that.
I also feel the reverse in that I feel like if he only had that scene, it would be better. Just this moment with this side character, and I like less when he comes back later.
Yeah, we'll get into that when we get to spoiler territory, but I'll agree there as well. I think a lot of that was very, very clunky. But before we get to the spoiler section, let's try to bring up some of the good stuff. So you mentioned this scene with Simon Helberg. It is good, I agree with you there. I will mention the exact opposite of what's all said. I actually think the artifice is probably one of the best things with this film. It works to a large extent. Some of the shots are incredible. And I actually really like the way Annette is used. That is to say, the baby. I think that it is eerie, it's a little bit unnerving, like it just adds to the oddness of everything, especially when the baby actually starts to sing. Yeah, I think it's very eye-catching, it's very gripping, and it's not a realistic film. Everything is set up with artifice, so I never bother me for a second that the baby is just a doll. And I think that oddness with it adds something very unique to the film. And another thing I really loved for it is how every single person involved just really, really went for it. Adam Driver with the stand-up comedy routine, even though it doesn't really work, he went there. You could see he tried to act the hell out of that scene. Marion Cotillard goes for it at every point too. And this is just a trivia, but I know that Simon Helberg literally changed his citizenship to be able to be in this film because he was so enthused. So it's really clear that every single person involved in this film really believed in it and really gave it everything they had. Oh, and as this trivia might be a little bit, not everyone knows it, Simon Helberg actually became French and lived there and learned the language so that he would essentially help have enough French people in the film to get funding. When Marion Cotillard came on board, all of those efforts kind of weren't needed, but he actually went that far just to be able to get that role. It's so yeah, very committed man.
That's kind of amazing that I haven't heard that, right? Because Annette was nominated for a bunch of César and stuff, and weirdly it wasn't talked about that much, I guess.
It is quite interesting how different my take is to Chris's take on having a doll there for baby Annette. And look, I agree it adds to the weirdness of the film, and it is a bit of a strange film, and I guess having that in there does make it a little bit unusual, and it does sort of fit in that way because it is part about the artifice. But I guess for me, it's just the emotion or the emotional attachment isn't there. I mean, the one thing about the film that does work for me, even though we don't really see his full character arc, is Adam Driver's performance. You know, that's for me probably the best thing about the film. And yet I had a lot of time trying to buy his feelings for his baby girl when his baby girl is a slab of plastic. And, you know, what springs to mind for me is this great comedy that came out a couple of years ago called Greener Grass, a take on like suburban soccer mums or whatever. And we've got this one mum who is trying to pretend to have an extra baby. So she takes a soccer ball and puts it under her dress, pretends it's a baby, and then she gives birth to it and she carries it around. Doesn't literally give birth to it, but she carries it around, the soccer ball, like a baby. And she has like photographs of it like a baby. And everyone else reacts to the soccer ball and pretends that it's like a baby, even though it's a soccer ball. And that's the sort of feeling that I had with Annette, that everybody's reacting to it being a child with expressions and emotions when it very clearly isn't. And yeah, I guess for me that's really hard, especially when my one into the film was Adam Driver's character, and yet I couldn't really get that into it because he's acting alongside a slab of plastic.
Will absolutely mirror your appreciation for Adam Driver there. I do think that his performance is the best in the film. It's one of the highlights of the film. And like I said, he really gave his all here. And yeah, so all kudos to Adam Driver. He went for everything, and some of it he sells really, really well. And I can only repeat my disagreement with Sol here that when the film is almost entirely artifice, or so largely artifice as it is, I think the baby fits. I don't think we'll see eye to eye on that. That's just some differences in taste as well. Sol brought up in the comment that, I'm the eternal Rade Jude fan, and every single one of the, top film of the year, we just get into these topics of artifice as well. So it makes sense that we'd have this disagreement. But to dive even more into Annette, let's put a quick spoiler warning here, because obviously a lot of things happen as the film progresses. There's especially one really sharp turn that changes almost everything. So if you have not yet seen Annette and our complaints have not stopped you from wanting to see it, just go out and watch it and then return to this podcast. So quick spoiler warning. And let's continue. Let's dive into this whole part, the latter part, where Adam Driver, it's played off as if we don't know if it's a full-on accident or if he actually murders her, but Anne falls off the boat due to his drunken madness. Coming back to that song, I'm Not That Drunk. I don't remember what the song is actually called, but that moment, that song really didn't work for me. Anne dies, she's swallowed by the sea. Henry McHenry, which is Adam Driver's character, go on a lifeboat there, and they go up on essentially this, I don't know what you would even call it, they're on this rock in the middle of the sea, and thinks he is having some sort of hallucinatory trip when Annette, the baby, starts to sing. And there's also an element here of magic. Anne is there as some apparition or ghost saying she will haunt him. What's happening with Annette could be seen as perhaps a possession, perhaps some kind of divine revenge. Something is happening here. She sings beautifully to an extent. I don't think the songs Annette have really work for me personally, but there is this big moment of seeing that something unique is happening here. And suddenly we're in the showbiz world. Simon Helberg is back. They're traveling around the world showing off Baby Annette. Is a big success. The film has taken a completely different gear. So let's dive into this second half of the film where baby Annette really takes the center. I guess Saul will hate this half more than anything else because it's just more plastic puppet. So let's start with you, Matthew. How did you feel about the second act?
I guess I think I like the second act better. It's weird. When I think of Annette, I think of a lot of moments that worked for me. And I guess these moments are more in the first half, aside from the ending, right? Because I think of the boat scene, right? The scene where Marion Cotillard dies. The birth of Annette, I think, is one of the better songs in the film. I think of the opening and I think of the ending. And yet, I think the film works better when you think about it as a tragedy purely centered on Adam Driver, right? On him. And Marion Cotillard being really a secondary character. Which of course is what the second half brings since she's dead. And I think regarding Annette and the artificiality of her being a puppet, I think it really pays off with the ending. The ending to me is the best moment of the film. Musically it works well. Duets are always very powerful and you really get to this whole point of the Annette being a puppet, right? It's because both of her parents are really seeing her at all, not seeing her as a human being really. And that she's being manipulated, she's being a puppet for both of them, him in life and her in death, right? You mentioned Annette being possessed, and I think that's definitely the idea, that her singing is a way for the Marion Cotillard character to haunt Adam Driver. And so I think the ending is really good because it brings an end to that, right? It's her rebelling against both of them in a way. So I think, dramatically speaking, the second part of the film is more interesting. However, it does run into the problem that you mentioned with the music, which is the repetition. I think especially the scene where Simon Helberg comes to see Adam Driver and he ends up murdering him. I don't know what that adds. I think, I guess I'm curious what you guys think about that scene because I think there's a lot of kind of filler, essentially, in the second half. It's less interesting visually and musically than whatever's going on in the first part, which doesn't all work for me at all, but is, I think, more interesting.
I think conceptually the second half is better, but in practice, I prefer the first half simply because I thought Marion Cotillard did very well. I thought the balance between her and Adam Driver, again, worked really well. The artifice and also the fakeness of the relationship and everything going on there. And I thought that when Marion Cotillard just disappears, more or less, the film lost something. And I have to say, no offense to Simon Helberg. I know he changed his citizenship. I know how far he went to get this role. But he is a very poor replacement of Marion Cotillard as the secondary lead. And that's essentially what he becomes in this third half. And he doesn't carry it as well. Conceptually, it works. You've discovered that essentially he was a lover of Anne of sorts. There's even this play that he could be Annette's real father. I do think that the murder, conceptually, it works. Again, I think it adds something because that is the moment where essentially Adam Driver just becomes completely unhinged. He is a killer now. The murder of Anne or the death of Anne, we're not sure if that was an accident or not, essentially. It's his fault, but in many ways it's an accident. Now he's a full-blown, cold-hearted murderer. And that changes his arc. It's the full and complete start of his downfall. So in terms of plotting, that really works. But I hated that scene. I think the singing in that scene was so poor. The fact that he just keeps dipping Simon Helberg's head down into the water. It felt so clunky. All the dialogue between them where they're singing in that scene, it felt so clunky and off. So I did not care that much for that scene. But I think what the film is doing in the second half conceptually really works. And I really agree with you, that ending is really strong.
I think the Simon Helberg murder scene is quite pivotal because it really establishes Henry McHenry as somebody deeply flawed, doing bad things on purpose. As we said before, the death of his wife, we're not sure how much of it's a drunken accident, how much of it's purposeful with intent. Well, what happens with Simon Helberg at the pool, there actually is the intent in there. So I guess that portrays him as definitely a highly flawed character, but still somebody who I guess I have some sympathy for. I mean, for me, what works about the second half of the film are the scenes with him in jail towards the end. I think it's the height of, Drive's performance for me, and it's sort of where we get away from the acting opposite a slab of plastic. So for me, I guess the second half was probably stronger for me. I don't know. I wasn't really a fan of either half of the film. I guess by the second half of the film, I'd resign myself to the fact that it's only going to be a 5 out of 10 for me. So maybe I had a bit more hopes of it during the first half, but I guess overall maybe prefer the second half. I'm not sure. They're probably on about the same level for me.
And I am happy we finally pinpointed something all of us can agree on, which is that ending. Because that is possibly the best scene in the film. I mean, it's the big payoff. And while for me the puppet worked, seeing the puppet change into a real person, I think what you said earlier, Matthew, about her essentially rejecting both the ghost of Anne and Henry McHenry, both of her parents, and standing up for herself. That was like the way it's shown from changing from the puppet to being a real person. That duet, almost everything in that final scene really worked for me. I think the song is probably the second best after the opener as well. So essentially, it's a film that starts off really well, it ends really well, but then I have this struggle in the middle. But I think that everything you guys are saying are true about that scene. It's absolutely resonant and it pulls everything together, and it's just such a perfect conclusion to the work. So kudos to that at least.
I don't have much of value to add, Chris, but you just reminded me that Adam Driver's character is named Henry McHenry, and I think that's hilarious, whether or not it's on purpose. I mean, I guess to stay on topic, yeah, I agree. The ending is great. It really makes me wish. I guess that's the way I feel about the film in general. I keep thinking of moments that are great, and I did like the film overall, but obviously I didn't love it. And I think if I could isolate these moments and make it into a movie, maybe it would be a great movie. But yeah, I think if I watch it, I will feel pretty much the same.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about rewatching it, knowing everything that happened, and knowing, like, because obviously for me, I came in hoping for a film I would really love and hoping for essentially one of my favorite films of the year based on just how much I generally love Leos Carax. So going in with low expectations this time, I might find more things I like. So on a rewatch, maybe this will end up being a fairly good movie for me. I'll have to see. I'm not sure how well that music is going to work out the second time around though. We never even really talked about Sparks. Like, how do you guys feel about Sparks? Because I actually, at least for a lot of their 70s works, I really like them. I think some of their albums are genuinely great. So I was really disappointed that not more of their songs here stood out.
Well, regarding Sparks, I just had never heard of them before Annette, and I haven't really tried to listen to more. I didn't think their music was great, except for a few moments. I know they're featured in Holy Motors, right, I think, and I will definitely watch that at some point, so maybe it will change my opinion.
Yeah, when Chris posed this question, I jumped on Wikipedia to read up about Sparks because, like Mature, I don't know much about them. I've probably heard several of their songs, which is the case for a lot of bands, but I just don't follow music as closely as I follow films. So generally, I find it really hard to talk about musicians offhand, unless they're especially well known.
That's perfectly fair. I guess that's another thing too, because liking Sparks, at least to a certain extent, they are actually one of the bigger bands of the 70s in terms of acclaim. So I might actually like them a little less than the consensus, and I would definitely recommend checking out the albums Kimono in My House and Propaganda for sure. Both from 74. Really interesting albums. Depending on what you like, they're like glam rock,
and I know that Edgar Wright made a documentary about them.
Yeah, that one was just called Sparks, right? I haven't seen that one yet. It's called The Sparks Brothers. Yeah, I'll definitely check that out. And that's also from 2001, so it could be really interesting. Especially as we're obviously prepping for our favorite films of 2021 episodes as well. So we're just watching all of the 2021 films we can get our hands on. And with that tease of what's coming up later this year, you should definitely look forward to it. We might even manage to see even more films preparation for this episode than last year. I think the only spoiler we have so far is that Annette will not be on any of our top lists. Because again, just look at this episode title. But like we talked about, it has a strong opener, a strong closer. There's a lot of interesting things going on here, and everyone involved clearly threw their best at it and tried to make this work. And as we also mentioned, it has gotten great acclaim across the board. There's fans everywhere. So if you're one of those fans and you want to argue with us, I'll just open the invitation once more. Come on icmforum.com. There will be a thread for this, so you can just jump right in there and just start disagreeing with us. So thank you so much for listening, and I guess we might see you soon. You have been listening to Talking Images. the official podcast of icmforum.com.